Ladies and gentlemen, if I can get you to all take your seats, we're just about to begin. Could I invite Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, the Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs of the French Republic, to come on stage as I introduce this session. The one thing I want to make clear is Minister Le Drian will be speaking in French. You all have translation sets that are available to you. These are now set at English. But if you do need to hear this in French, please turn to channel 3. And if you need to hear this in German, please turn to channel 4. These are set to English. As you take your seats, I'd like to just outline the fact that we're going to have a whole host of people up here to speak, beginning, of course, with the keynote of the Minister. A stronger Europe in the world is one of the top priorities of the von der Leyen Commission. We've seen the COVID-19 crisis make that a pretty difficult priority to achieve. And as we can see, Europe has pledged to promote a responsible global leadership. And we can begin after the hellos are said, of course, because we have a whole host of things to talk about. This is one of the most critical conversations we will have at GLOBSEC in Bratislava this year, about where Europe really stands in the global leadership position in the post-COVID era. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Minister Le Drian to the stage to give his keynote.
Je vais enlever mon masque. Je suis testé négatif. Messieurs les ministres, chers amis, 30 ans après l'année qui vit la réunification de notre continent,
30 years on from the year that saw the reunification of our continent and the adoption of the Charter of Paris for a new Europe, I believe that we can be proud of the progress we have made.
Je voulais commencer en le rappelant, car
I meant to begin by reminding us of all of that, because in these times of adversity, it's crucial to keep the memory of what we have already been through together intact. In the middle of the autumn of 1990, the Europeans were at last recovering alongside all the other freedoms, that of taking their own destiny in hand. History was just speeding up after brutally separating us. It suddenly reunited us. And suddenly, we saw the face of the world fade away, a world which for so long had held us in a tragic division. Suddenly, the hope of building a new Europe was restored after decades of confrontation and hemiplegia. Europeans were reunited, and Europe was at last reconciled with itself. That is why I prefer the beautiful word of reunification, which brings us together, to the world of enlargement, which distances us from one another. But this immense historic effort has, if I may, captured us. Over the last 30 years, it has consumed all of our energies, and we've let ourselves act as if the march of the world was ultimately not our own business. Moreover, the guarantee of American power seemed secured, and the end of history appeared to have come. And we used this geopolitical lull to focus on ourselves and carry out this colossal enterprise, the reunification of our continent as a community of values and interests, which remains absolutely unparalleled. Yes, unparalleled, because nowhere else in the world have nations decided freely to link their destinies to one another, to pool some of their prerogatives, even the most sovereign thereof, to share a common currency. But we did all of that, not only to gain efficiency together, but also in the name of everything that altogether brings us together and surpasses us. I mean the history that we share and the shared desire to continue writing our history all together. But let me be clear. This long period of time, these 30 years focusing on ourselves was necessary. Necessary given the scale of this task. Necessary too, given the challenges that we have to face and that we faced successfully, the economic and financial crisis of 2008, the repeated terrorist assaults on our societies, the migration crisis of 2015 and 2016, the coronavirus crisis, the actions of external powers which have sought to confront us from the outside and divide us from the inside, attempting to exacerbate the disagreement that can emerge between our countries and within our societies to make them fault lines that, although artificial, are not less dangerous. But that has enabled us to face up all of these challenges. That has always been the strength of European solidarity since the Schuman Declaration some 70 years ago. So this was necessary, but while we were busy on our European introspection, the rest of the world changed. The international stage has become a little more brutal every day. And even in our neighborhood, we're seeing many conflicts multiply due to the modernization of military capabilities, the proliferation of sensitive technologies, the interventionist ambitions of external powers, with no qualms about fomenting disorder to advance their pawns. We're seeing the importing of foreign mercenaries, the use of private military contractors, the instrumentalization of refugee flows, misinformation. All of that are used as new influence strategies. We are seeing destabilization become a fully fledged power instrument. And in Ukraine, Syria, Lebanon, and now in Nagorno-Karabakh, we're seeing these harmful dynamics internationalize and hasten crisis with local roots. This reality, for too long, we dare not look in the face. For too long, we have believed that, thanks to a sort of European exception, we could escape the perils of this new global context. But let us be clear, the bloc we form is today being defied, marginalized, and the risk is that it can be transformed into a theater of influence. So I meant to take stock. This is where we stand, a success and a negligence during these 3 decades. And I believe that the 2 main questions of the year 1990 are raised for us again in the light of the pandemic crisis, the world to come and what we are. The difference is that we are now in the context of the COVID crisis. And I therefore would like to bring about a simple message. We have a very clear choice. We must emerge from the withdrawal in which we've lived for too long, or we will be swept out of our own history. There is a risk, which I dare calling existential, for our Europe, and faced with that risk, our only option is to look anew towards the world to defend our unique model. The time, I believe, has therefore come for Europeans, if they really wish to keep control, to once more conceive their destiny within the march of the world. And for me, there is hardly any doubt. The construction of Europe is now also played out beyond our borders, in the efforts that we can and that we must make to influence international affairs and make a distinct and stronger mark. The paradox, but it is a fruitful paradox, is that this dynamic of looking beyond ourselves and globally asserting ourselves can also serve at the same time to ensure we fully remain who we are, to rediscover the thread of our European ambitions, overcoming the narcissism of our small differences, to rediscover in a world the meaning of our collective adventure, because sometimes our Europe appears to have lost its bearings. The shock of Brexit, the rise of populist movements and centrifugal forces, the repeated violations of the principles and values that are the very heart of our union, and the promotion of illiberal democracy. All of these signs should alert us. They are the precursors of a sickness of languidness into which no doubt excessive introspection could thrust us. As I was saying, the fractures and the loss of bearings characterize our times, and the COVID crisis is very much a terrifying revealer, as well as a great accelerator. But the series of undermining activities that today seek to blur the lines of international affairs, of course, these did not arrive with the pandemic. And we need to acknowledge that we shall all benefit from establishing and respecting shared rules. This idea is the one that enabled us to recover from the tragedy of 2 world wars. And let us acknowledge it, this idea is no longer the subject of a consensus. Multilateralism is even suffering from a threefold chronic illness. The temptation of unilateral withdrawal, I have in mind the Trump administration, systematic blocking, I'm thinking of Russia, and instrumentalization of common institutions to benefit special interests. Here I'm thinking of China. The outcome is a world in which the frameworks for our regulatory and collective action have been weakened. To put it simply, a world that is increasingly stranger to who we are, we Europeans. Next, the undermining of the European security architecture, the foundations of which were laid by the Charter of Paris, is a case in point. Over the last few years, this architecture has been dismantled methodically and systematically. The key principles of the Charter, the inviolability of borders and the sovereignty of states, have been flouted, such as in Ukraine, where Crimea has been annexed illegally, and we do not and will never accept it. When repression and arbitrary arrests answer the people's refusal of an illegitimate election in Belarus, and the offer of mediation by the OSCE is rejected, it is yet another foundation of the Charter of Paris, which is again flouted. And when arms control agreements are challenged on the pretext that the cooperative approach to governing strategic rivalries is excessively binding, there it is the indivisibility of security that is weakened, and our security that regresses. So, in a way, these huge regresses confirm somehow, as the Charter said, that in order to strengthen peace and security among our states, the advancement of democracy and respect for and effective exercise of human rights are indispensable. We cannot make the link any clearer between humanistic values and building our collective European security. Ladies and gentlemen, the actions and strategy of Russia have played a significant role in this weakening of the European security architecture. The instability and the challenging of common rules resulting from this reduce European security. And that is why we consider that it is not in our common interest to accept this situation without seeking to restore channels for communication and to re-establish rules of behavior which can strengthen our security. Hence, our twofold attitude with regard to Russia: dialogue and firmness. Dialogue without naivety, because we cannot envisage rebuilding a collective security system in Europe and restoring stability without seeking to involve Russia. And the difficulty of carrying out this dialogue successfully must not sap our will to continue it, but also firmness, because the violation of European and international norms cannot go unanswered, because Russia must provide answers to the question we ask it. When we observe, for example, that a Russian opposition figure, Mr. Navalny, has been the victim of an attempted murder on the territory of Russia, using a chemical weapon from the Novichok family that was developed by Russia. And because, absent such answers, it is our responsibility to draw the conclusions, as France has done this week with Germany, proposing that the European Union should sanction those responsible for this attempted murder, which is unacceptable, both from a democratic standpoint and because it normalizes the use of chemical weapons. Dialogue is not an excuse for playing for time. We must be very clear. Dialogue with Russia does not mean doing it a favor. It does not mean abandoning our ambition to build a peaceful continent. On the contrary, it means defending this ambition by asserting firmness and getting ready to play hardball whenever necessary. A European security architecture can only be meaningful if the states within it respect common rules. This imperative applies to all, including Russia. That was true back in 1990, when we signed the Charter of Paris, and it is still true in 2020. Dialogue and firmness is also our approach to China, which for us can be at the time a partner, without which we cannot rise to the challenges of the environmental and climate emergency, a competitor, particularly in the economic and technological fields, and even a systemic rival, to use the words of the European Commission, a systemic rival in the battle of models. It is therefore indispensable to talk to China, and it is indispensable for Europeans to do so with a single voice, without naivety or taboos, on all subjects that are important to us. Firstly, reciprocity in our economic and commercial exchanges. And this requirement for reciprocity must be held high, without any hesitation. In a relation like ours, there is no place for one-way roads, and I have in mind the new Silk Road. Ultimately, what we have to say to China is very simple. We want to take what it says at face value. China says it is in favor of multilateralism. Very fine, that it must agree to correct everything that weakens international cooperation, first by giving up any unilateral action, second by ending the asymmetry in access to its market, and thirdly by making the requirements of sustainable development the new compass of our relations, including in trade and our cooperation. And next, China's fulfillment of its international commitments. I have in mind Hong Kong, and in particular Xinjiang, where we are committed to ensuring that the massive violations of Uyghur human rights are brought to an end. We also need to be more assertive with the United States and in the transatlantic relationship, asking for a better sharing of responsibilities to be matched with a better sharing of the burden. France's commitment within NATO, alongside all of our allies, including the United States, is intact. The President's recent visit to Lithuania has further recalled our contribution to the enhanced forward presence, which is an integral part of the alliance deterrence and defense posture. The strategic reflection process France proposed within NATO a year ago should contribute to strengthening the alliance. And in a few weeks, we will receive the conclusions of the work carried out over the course of a year by the group of experts mandated as requested by Heiko Maas and myself on the occasion of a ministerial meeting at NATO. So one of the absolute prerequisites for a strong alliance is now that Europeans act more proactively and shoulder more responsibilities within an overhauled and rebalanced alliance. There cannot be a European defense without NATO, just as there cannot be a credible and sustainable NATO without lasting European defense commitments. This reality has led us to take important steps since 2017 in consolidating tools aimed at making European forces more capable, more proactive and better equipped, and this effort must continue. But whatever happens in November, we cannot expect American voters to answer for us the questions we are asking ourselves. Everything we've done to strengthen our ability to defend our defense and security interests is not against one party or another, and even less so, of course, against the transatlantic relationship. It is done for ourselves. Let us never lose sight of this fact, because the debate in Washington also sketches out the prospect of a profound change in the security guarantee America offers its allies. And whoever the next president is, it will be easier for him to defend increased U.S. engagement alongside Europeans with his voters if the Europeans do shoulder their responsibilities. And starting now, when our interests are threatened, we must stand united to act. And once again, get ready to play hardball without abandoning dialogue. That's what we're doing in the Eastern Mediterranean, deploying all our options at our disposal in response to the tactics of fait accompli and intimidation, and to bring together the conditions for constructive negotiation. And in June, a Turkish Navy ship engaged in hostile maneuvers against a French frigate, the Corvette, which was doing nothing other than executing the orders received from NATO chain of command to monitor illegal flows in the central Mediterranean. The Corvette suspected a Turkish merchant ship, the Sirkin, of participating in violations of the UN embargo, arms embargo on Libya. And I welcome the response made to this serious incident. First, the response at NATO, where the Secretary General took the responsibility of working on safety measures to ensure such behaviors did not occur again between allies. And second, the answer at the European Union, where the 27 decided on the 21st of September to sanction the shipping company responsible for the Libya embargo violations committed by the Sirkin. That is the only valid approach to deal with autocratic powers that are testing and constantly testing our limits. And this approach, those who legitimately demand firmness vis-à-vis Russia, and I say this is essential for France, must also dare to apply the same firmness to Turkey in the name of Europe and also in the name of NATO. Because throwing a prudish veil over abuses of this sort will not help strengthen NATO. The problem must be named and must be grasped the nettle, and we must grasp the nettle through dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, as I suggested, it is time to globally assert what we are and what we stand for. That means, firstly, asserting ourselves as united bloc, faithful to our values and defending the autonomy of our model, while going further in building our European sovereignty. This common sovereignty is not the opposite, but rather the continuation, the supplement, and even in the context of the brutalization of international affairs and the normalization of predatory attitudes. The guarantee, this common sovereignty is the guarantee of our national sovereignties. And I say this today in Bratislava, in Slovakia, a country where you know what it means to be disposed of its sovereignty and to recover it thanks to European reunification and thanks to our union. The strength of our European solidarity, through which it is true that we bind one another together, is also paradoxically that it protects our independence. And those who do not accept it and prefer simplistic oppositions certainly do not understand this continent and its history. Asserting yourself as a European does not mean turning your back on your country. On the contrary, it means loving your country enough to give it every chance to strive. We have begun to strengthen this common sovereignty in the most strategic sectors: industry, trade policy, defense, digital technology. This is a vast effort that we will continue in each of these key fields. And now, of course, also in the health field to prepare us for the eventuality of further pandemics. And in the energy field as well, starting by diversifying our supplies. But to fully reconcile what we are for ourselves and what we are in the world, we must also assertively turn our model into a humanist force in this competition of value, which I'm convinced is one of the essential dimensions of international competition today. We can be proud of our European model, so long as we acknowledge that the price of this pride is the duty to always stand ready to defend it, including against political leaders who, even within our union, deliberately twist its demands. Yesterday, we made it the foundation of our reunification. Today, we need to propose our model as the compass for a change of course in globalization. This model has made Europe the most advanced continent in the protection of fundamental rights, and most revealingly, the continent of the abolition of the death penalty. The continent, too, that has upheld the rule of law to the highest degree. The continent of landmark regulation. The continent of intellectual and academic freedoms. A continent, lastly, which, after decades of civil war, managed to exploit, no less, of making its diversity of national histories and cultures live together. This model made us just as much as we made it, and that is why sharing it on the international stage is a natural next step in asserting our sovereignty. But that is not all. And if I had to describe it in one word, I would say it is a humanist model, simply because it is based on nothing other than a certain idea of humankind, its dignity and its potential. It is not based on transcendence or on providence, but on humankind, and humankind alone. That is, I believe, what gives it a universal reach. And it is what makes it the possible matrix of a useful third way. Here again, first of all, for us, but potentially for others on our planet. A third way to overcome the rivalries that undermine the international community, because we have nothing to gain from allowing a new duopoly to form. And that is what drives our European efforts to bring together all powers of goodwill within the Alliance for Multilateralism that I launched a year ago with HECOMAS in New York to demonstrate that collective action is more than ever before a guarantor of effectiveness. A third way to overcome the false choices that paralyze us in the face of today's challenges, such as in the digital field, the false choice between the proponents of an authoritarianism 2.1, you know who I have in mind, and those who are prepared to blindly hand over to ruthless, lawless private actors. With the GDPR, which has inspired legislation far beyond Europe's frontiers, we have begun to show that it is possible to foster controlled development and new technologies. A third way that is crucial to defend our common goods, our health and our planet, to cite only a few examples, that must not be sacrificed to antagonism and individual greed. A third way that meets the requirements of tomorrow, my dear friends, this is the direction Europe can take to rise up to the many challenges. We should walk away, Europe that fully emerging from the age of innocence to finally enter the age of responsibilities, together, because this is what makes us strong. This is the vision promoted by France, but it is not alone. This is also the meaning of the initiatives we're taking at 27 alongside our partners in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. And it is in this spirit that France is preparing to hold the presidency of the Council of the European Union in the first half of 2022. Thank you for your attention.
Indeed. Can Europe be the global leader through this crisis and beyond, and can it lead responsibly? It's the gazillion euro question, isn't it? I think it's pretty established that the continent is up for the commitment to a rules-based, fair system, but on the flip side, we have been called slow, ineffective, even slightly compromised by our membership, and sometimes what we want to do is not what we end up doing. So can a German presidency at the Council, a German European Commission president, lead us on a new path? That will be an interesting part of the debate that we will have at this point. So let's invite this distinguished panel up on stage. Can I ask Yvonne Korchok, the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic, up first? That's your seat. we have a lovely surprise for you. I did promise you this yesterday. Things may go wrong because we're trying a hybrid conference, but nice surprises can happen, and we have one. Heiko Maas is here. We were pleasurably pleased to know that he was coming for this forum. He is, of course, the Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany, if I can get you to join us on stage. And also, Nikos Dendias, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hellenic Republic, is also joining us. And online, and joining us remotely, is Bogdan Aurescu. He is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania. Gentlemen, thank you all very much for being here. It's very timely that we're having this conversation. I do want to remind you all that we will, of course, have questions, as usual, from the audience. Remember, keep your questions brief. Introduce yourself, the organization you represent. Remember, the wonderful GLOBSEC staff are holding these massive boom mics, and they are heavy. Remember what I told you yesterday, their arms will fall off and it'll be on your heads. So keep it short. And for those of us joining online on the room, please make sure that you are texting us via the app and also via Zoom. I will have this up and running at some point. And if I can get it up, we will ensure that we have your questions ready to go. I'm going to ask one of the staff members to come and have a look to see what is going on with my system. But once we get that fixed, we'll get started on questions from all of you. The one thing I want to do, ministers, and if I can open it up to all of you, is to first look inward, because I know we'd like to make proclamations of what we'd like to be, but the one thing that does hold us back is sometimes what's happening in our own houses. So if I ask that critical question of how do we appear to the world? How does the world see us from your perspective? It's your job. You go out there, you tell the story of Europe. Do you think the world looks at us as leaders of leaders in a free world who can take decisive actions? We're not really on board together about pretty much anything when it comes to taking decisions. Turkey, Belarus have been mentioned. The EU COVID recovery fund's a great example, making it through the Council with lots of compromises. Compromise seems to be the factor that rules us all. So the question here for you, if I can get you all to start off, and maybe Yvonne, you can kick us off. How do you think the world views us? As a leader, an active participant, a passive observer, busy with our own issues?
Well, thank you. And before I try to respond or share my view, could I say how glad I am to have my colleagues here with me physically. And I want to thank you all, Jean-Yves, Heiko and Nikos and Bogdan remotely for your courage to come. I'm repeating that it's something, you know, that in previous years has been taken for granted that we are meeting here, but all of a sudden the fact that a physical conference is taking place is an expression of courage, and some say even that organizers must have been nuts that they have dared organize this. So in fact you are recognizing this ability of organizers to show with this event that maybe we will have to live with COVID. But COVID will not entirely paralyze our life, and we will accommodate somehow. And I think this is a first attempt to come up with that evidence. Now, to your question, how does the world look at us, if I understand that correctly? I mean, two angles that I feel is used when they are trying to understand what EU is all about. First, they of course are looking into our own backyard. So what's the state, if you want, of the Union? And here certainly they have been seen as, at least in recent 10 years, so in the last decade, through the multiple crises that those have been chasing us for quite some time. You remember it started more than 10 years ago with the euro crisis, where our common currency almost collapsed. Then we saved that. We saved euro, and immediately another crisis showed up, migration, and so on, and so the Russian aggression, and so on. So the world is looking at EU through our ability to cope with these challenges. And I think Of course, there can always be a reason for pessimism, but we should not really be completely pessimistic, because look at Europe. I mean, of course, it's still half pregnant, if I may say so. It's incomplete, the economic and monetary union. Migration, we are struggling with that, and I hope with the Commission's proposal we will somehow try to find a model that is acceptable. We're trying to cope with the country which has challenged the post-1990 order, Russia, by invasion, by annexation of Crimea and so on and so on. We still have to come to terms with the fact that one country has decided to leave. And I could continue like that. So the first angle from which the rest of the world is looking at us, how we are dealing with our own domestic, so to say, issues. The second angle is they're looking at us in terms of how we are able to live up to our own ambition to be a global player, because we claim a global position in the world, and that they logically look at this ambition of European Union through our ability to achieve sort of order and stability in our closest neighborhood. And here I think we should be doing more when it comes to Ukraine. Now a big challenge in Belarus, but look at the southern neighborhood. So I think that there is a clearly a thing that you cannot claim global leadership unless you are able to organize your own neighborhood. And I believe, and I'll wrap up with that, that unless we do something with the most underdeveloped policy of all in European Union, and that's our common foreign and security policy, nobody would trust the European Union that we can credibly be a global player. In CFSP, we have to move from the point, basically, where we boil down our positions to the lowest common denominator. We agree something, but who in the world cares about that? I wish we had more courageous approach to what we do together. So two angles, internally and external impact, if you want. That's how I see it.
Thank you for that, because I wanted to pick up with Minister Mas and ask you, do we have a leg to stand on when we go out and say we want to lead the world, when compromise is what the EU is built on? And how do you, when you go out into the world, think that the world views Europe?
First, thank you for introducing me as a nice surprise. It's not always the case when I'm traveling. Thank you very much. Und ich würde gerne Ihre Frage beantworten, weil das ein Thema ist, das mich
because that is an issue that keeps me busy when I'm traveling around the world. How is Europe seen from the outside? And what I see and what I hear about this is that very often, and regardless of where I'm traveling, people tell me that they expect more from Europe. I believe that we must not do too many things at a time or just have illusions about Europe could be the world leader. But I believe that when it comes to shaping the development of the free world and liberal democracies, that we could do a lot more than we're currently doing and have been doing. And to be honest, I also believe that this is not linked to Corona or the post-COVID world. I think it is a challenge that we have to face up to in Europe. We live in a competition of big powers between the US, Russia and China. The challenges resulting from that can only be addressed together with a European answer. And if we don't do that, because everybody believes that in individual cases there might be short-term advantages through dealing with China directly or dealing with the US separately, this will not be a long-term solution. It won't be lasting. A former Belgian Prime Minister, one of the forgotten founding fathers of the European Union, once said there are only two countries in Europe, two sorts of countries, small countries and countries that haven't yet realized that they are small. And I think that this is true. It's still true today, and I can only fully support what Jean-Yves said in his speech. We need a common approach for the United States. I don't know who will win the elections, but I don't think that everything will change, regardless of who will be the next president. We have to get used to the fact that the U.S. will withdraw from its former role as the world police step by step, and it's true what Jean-Yves said, therefore. The U.S. are our closest ally outside the European Union. We are allies within NATO, and if we want to live up to our role, we need to strengthen the European pillar within NATO. We also need a common approach when it comes to dealing with Russia, and we believe that this needs to be a dual approach. In cases like we've seen right now, the poisoning of Mr. Navalny, we need to speak a very clear language in the EU, but we also need to know that we need Russia. They are part of our neighborhood. We need Russia to solve the conflicts in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine. And Jean-Yves elaborated on that. We need to be able to play hardball, but at the same time we must never let dialogue be stopped. And this is why within NATO we have again and again advocated for holding meetings of the NATO-Russia Council. And the same is true for China. I don't believe that China is trying to single out individual countries and buy them out of the European Union. I don't think that the 17+1 initiative, which interestingly is called 1+17 initiative in Beijing, I don't think that this is a valuable contribution, but China is an important player for us. It's become the most important trading partner for Germany. But Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, the South China Sea, all the issues that we are seeing, it just can't be that we only look at trade interests and economic interests. There are values that we have set as a foundation for ourselves, and we need to stand up for these when we are dealing with China. But it only makes sense if we do that together as Europeans, and this is why we need more new European sovereignty, as we call it in our presidency of the EU. We don't want to be going forth and back in this competition of powers. And let me speak about the regions: North Africa, the Sahel zone, the new center of the international terrorism. The Middle East is also in our vicinity, and with regard to Iran and Israel, the Abraham Accords, I think there is a window of opportunity, and the eastern neighborhood of the European Union also needs to be on our agenda.
And I do want to pick up on that, because I think that is a question of looking outward, but I did want to also get Minister Dendez's opinion on what you just brought up about sovereignty and about issues within Europe of how different countries perceive a united foreign policy. Mr. Dendez, have we really brought ourselves to a point where we can have a united front, a united foreign policy, united strategy, a security policy? Your country has been at the forefront for a few years now with migration as being one of the big issues. Turkey is another one. Do you think it's possible?
Well, thank you for the question. And if I may start by expressing my gratitude to Ivan for giving me the opportunity to be here today and sharing this panel with Jean-Yves and Heiko. Now, on the question, well, usually I give straight answers. And the straight answer on straight questions is a no. Unfortunately, is a no, but with a caveat. The European Union is a new experiment, and if I may say so, a very proud experiment. If you go by car from Brussels to Amsterdam or from Brussels to Paris, you pass from battlefields of the past century, with millions of people who have lost their lives. And yet again, these countries, all these countries, this family of nations and countries, have chosen to live together and have achieved something that if we have spoken about it in, let's say, in 1930, it would have been totally impossible even to imagine that would ever happen. So, for this historically short period of time, the European Union has created, I may say, the most proud achievement in the history of humanity. Having said that, unfortunately, time does not wait. Challenges do not wait. So, to your question, which has to do with foreign policy and with the challenges on the periphery, and you listed migration as a challenge of cardinal importance, in which, let's be frank between us, we lack a common approach. But it's not the only one. Jean-Yves, in his excellent presentation before, mentioned quite a few. Our reaction to Russia, our reaction to Turkey. Heiko spoke eloquently about the Sahel, about terrorism, about the Middle East. Is Europe up to those challenges? The answer is no. For understandable reasons. You cannot expect this to happen within 60, 70, 50 years. But yet again, unfortunately, those challenges do not wait. So the answer is a no, but with an optimism. We can do better. We are trying to do better. Much effort is needed. My country very many times felt quite alone. For example, in the recent crisis with Turkey in southeastern Mediterranean, we didn't feel that we got all the solidarity we wanted. But yet again, this is a process into making.
Minister Aurescu, if I can bring you in here and ask you, from your perspective, do you feel part of a common approach for a common foreign policy, foreign security standing of the EU, or do you feel that we're still working our way there and we're not ready for global leadership in the European Union?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, to Ivan for his remarks. I just want to make sure that I don't have a lack of courage to travel to Bratislava, but unfortunately, due to some commitments and lack of good connections, I was unable to be there in presence. But I'm glad that I can be together with you, Ivan, with Jean-Yves, with Heiko, and with Nikos. What I can say is that indeed the world can see EU with both its ups and downs. And for instance, when at the beginning of the crisis, the EU was blamed for the lack of action and for the failure to show solidarity with some of its member states. The critics of the European Union were very happy, and they used this and tried to play this initial weakness against the EU's claim of a global role. But after the EU came with a lot of important measures, like the regulation of transport corridors, like access to joint procurement procedures for medical equipment and medicines, or the creation of the strategic reserve for medical equipment, which is RescEU, hosted first by Romania and now joined by Germany, and culminating with the adoption of the recovery plan. I think they started to look at the EU with some sort of an admiration, because we were able to cope with these challenges of the crisis. And I think they also look at the EU with hope, because EU is not just a bunch of states trying to cope with certain crises, but we also represent a regulatory power and an ensemble of democratic societies, meaning that, when we talk about resilience, which is very much on our minds, when we discuss about how EU should be shaped in a better way in the near future, and not only, we don't only speak about health equipment, but we also speak about democratic values. We also speak about the adherence to a set of rules which are making the order-based global order. In order to answer to your question, I think it's work in progress, and I think we should try to define better which are our common interests, and this means a joint effort from both the EU institutions and the member states. I think the EU institutions could hear more the concerns of the member states, and the member states could try to to hear in a more attentive manner which are the interests of the other member states, just in order to find which is the common interest that we should promote together. So I think a better foreign policy of the European Union is achievable. And this does not and cannot be solved only by formally changing the way we take decisions, because this is another discussion whether we should move from...
That's a whole other discussion.
Indeed, from unanimity to majority decision making. But I think it's very important that we develop together a sort of code of conduct inspired by the spirit of the treaties. And in this way, we could move together towards a more efficient foreign policy of the European Union. I think EU can claim a global role if at least three conditions are well fulfilled. The first condition is that we have to be aware that EU is entitled to this leadership role, because we have all the prerequisites of being a leader, especially on this value-based system. The second is that EU has to earn its leadership role, because nobody will give it to us if we don't have this concern to make it happen. And third, and this is very much about the concept of strategic autonomy that, again, it's on our tables these days. Well, earning it is not necessarily about differentiating us from others, but also about identifying ways to cooperate with others. And when I say others, I mean like-minded others. And I will stop here for the time being.
Minister, thank you for that. I want to pick up on what Minister Aurescu just mentioned and talk a little bit about we need to earn the right to be leaders in the world. How do you all see that happening if we are seen to be compromising significantly in-house in terms of rule of law? We hold ourselves up as a rules-based organization. So when we go out and we look at mediating, negotiating, diplomacy in other regions, and we are seen as compromising with certain states, do you think that weakens our position as potentially leaders in a global sphere? Anyone want to pick that one up? Mr. Maas?
Ich muss erst mal einen Punkt ansprechen, der mir auch immer mehr auffällt. Der ist gerade während der Corona-Pandemie aufgefallen.
It also came to my mind in the Corona crisis. There is this fight of narratives.
Wobei ich mal dazu sagen will,
but let me also mention that as a German foreign minister, you should rather be a bit hesitant when it comes to assuming leading roles in the world or claiming such roles for oneself. But I realized that, especially over the last 2 months during the Corona crisis in China, for example, there has been such a new dimension of strategic communication with the only goal to anchor a narrative in Europe that the Chinese were the ones, as Jean-Yves said, who really are those acting in terms of multilateralism and really helping others, etc. And I feel that in the Navalny case, Russia is trying to establish a narrative that couldn't be more absurd, but is putting huge amounts of effort into winning this fight about narratives in this individual case and other cases as well. And in the United States, the American president does this all by himself via Twitter. And I believe that in Europe, we should also deal with the question of, yes, we do have problems. We have problems within the EU when it comes to migration, for example. Also in individual countries when it comes to the rule of law. However, if you talk to people across the globe and ask them what they expect from Europe and how they see Europe, there are 50 million refugees in the world, and I'm 100% sure most of those being asked, where do you want to go? What's the place to be for you? They would say Europe. I want to go to Europe. And this is why I believe, without wanting to be arrogant or anything, but we need to really see what we have achieved. Have we merited this leading role is a question that we need to answer, and then we should be more self-confident. in defending that. And I think many people across the world believe that what we have been able to achieve in Europe, and Jean-Yves made such a great summary of that: liberal democracies, freedom, rule of law, fairness, justice. This is the most desirable environment many people want to live in, and I think that gives us the right to defend of course, our values in any case, but also our interests in the world in a much stronger way. And also live up to what many people expect from us. And I think we should start. Others are building up strategic communication in order to create a better image for themselves in the world. And maybe we should start talking in a better way, in a more positive way about ourselves than we're currently doing.
That's a great point. And our first question from our audience online has come in for Minister Le Drian. Did you feel that France received enough support for its initiative in Lebanon? Could European partners have done more to support that initiative? I can repeat the question.
Lebanon? Yeah.
Minister Le Drian, a question from Eamon online. He's asking, did you feel that France received enough support for its initiative in Lebanon? Could European partners have done more to support the initiative?
Au Liban, la responsabilité principale appartient aux Libanais. Et ce que je dis aujourd'hui, c'est que les Libanais, l'ensemble des acteurs politiques,
all of the political stakeholders with all their different backgrounds,
attachements confessionnels,
all the groups, all the religions, they did not live up to their responsibilities. And this is what France is saying, because we have a long history with Lebanon. But it is also what the European Union is saying. When we gather together, the ministers of foreign affairs, when we discuss Lebanon, we agree on that. Lebanon is going through a crisis beyond the tragedy of the blast. Lebanon is going through a political crisis, which has been ongoing for a long time already. They're going through an economic crisis. Half of the Lebanese people are below the poverty line. They are going through a moral crisis, a social crisis, and on the 17th of October, it will be 1 year since the first demonstrations against the inactivity of all political actors. So France, as well as the rest of the European Union, said it on many occasions, and Heiko himself traveled to Lebanon. We're saying it so that the Lebanese authorities should face up to their responsibilities. Everybody knows what it takes in terms of reforms. Everybody knows what it takes for this country, except that at the moment they're not facing up to their responsibilities. I hope they will. And I believe all of the Europeans share the same point of view, and we express this on a number of occasions.
So the question then comes up with all of the other issues, and you've all brought up the Middle East, you've brought up Russia, you've brought up Turkey, Belarus. In a number of these scenarios, the standing option seems to be dialogue, and that's what the EU excels at. Sometimes, though, dialogue isn't going to work. It doesn't work every time. Do we have the strength and the will to follow through, as has been suggested, that we need to be firmer? And how do we be firmer? Because sometimes we're seen as using sanctions and specific sanctions in a slightly weak-handed way. How do you go out in the world when dialogue doesn't work to show that you mean business because you are leaders and that's what you stand for? I'm leaving that open to everyone to address the issues that have arisen in the last couple of months across the world.
I'll try.
Yes,
first, before we enter into that dialogue for which we're calling, I believe the precondition to have an impact on our partner is our own unity. And I have been in this job of foreign minister just for 6 months, but I believe that internally in the European Union we have to have a more intensive, sometimes even more controversial discussion about the most important issues in order to have not only positions on many issues, but to have policies on those issues. Take Russia, for example. Is it a policy that we still remain on what we have adopted as a response to what happened in 2014, Russia annexation and so on? So it's not a policy, it's guiding principles. And one of those principles is so-called selective engagement. So, and there is obvious a very subjective interpretation what selective engagement with Russia means. But we have to have a united position, otherwise Russia and other players would not take us seriously on many issues. We need unity in many other issues. Take, for example, Middle East. There is dynamics obviously triggered by the Abraham Accords and other normalization of relationship between Israel and other Arab countries. Which brings me also to the point that we are not using many instruments that we are having in our hands, and it is money, for example. By far is the European Union the biggest development assistance donor in the world. But what are we receiving in exchange? And I don't want to say that it should be revenues or financial revenues, but it cannot be that we are spending money worldwide in many regions. And, for example, in Africa, countries are not ready to cooperate with us on migration, on readmission of illegal migrants. And because they're not ready, we are exposed then to a very heavy impact of migration in Europe. So I think unity, using more assertively instruments at our hands, and once again to have policies instead of positions. And for me, in that big picture, where we urgently need a, first of all, internal discussion is the transatlantic bond and relationship. If we continue like this, a strategic decoupling between us will continue in many areas. So whoever wins it in November in the United States, we are the closest partners. And I think United States should understand it cannot withstand global competition with China unless we do it together. And we in Europe should absolutely understand that we have to do more to be a better, more able, more capable partner for the United States globally. So those are the 2 or 3 preconditions, as I see them, in order to make Europe stronger in the world.
Anyone want to agree or disagree on what's been suggested in terms of having teeth and more bite than bark?
Yeah, we're good at barking.
We're very good at barking. Can we bite when we need to, Mr. Maas?
Ich würde es etwas diplomatischer formulieren
I'd say it in more diplomatic
Heiko, wieso? Du und diplomatisch und ich und politisch?
Diplomatic or political? Well, in content, you're right, Yvonne, and there are many areas in which we take more concrete stances. But what do we invest across the world, and in how far do we link this to strategic partnerships is an important point. And in the last year, we started a Latin America initiative. During our presidency as well, we want to host a big conference with the foreign ministers of the Latin American countries, because we have realized that, for example, China is not only active within Asia and Africa, but also is very present in Latin America with a lot of money. And without any hesitation, the investment made there are linked to political concessions or political strategic decisions trying to bind these countries closer to China and its policies. And when I traveled into Latin America, almost everybody told me we would absolutely prefer to be working with you in Europe, but you have to be here. Where are your projects? And this is why I believe, yes, where we have strategic partnerships, we should have strategic partnerships, economic cooperation, and also enhance political ties, and not only bind these regions more to our interests, but also have this value discussion that we want to have. And I think there are many opportunities that still differ from what China is doing. This is almost blackmailing, if you will. So I think we could do a lot more. I fully agree with Yvonne here. Also by taking money into our hands, yes.
Any questions in the room? There's one right there.
Thank you. It's a question for Minister Maass. It's Tom Nuttall from The Economist. Mr. Maass, a few weeks ago you caused a lot of excitement in Germany when you told Bild am Sonntag that if Russia was not forthcoming about the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, Germany would be forced to reconsider the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. Russia has not been forthcoming on the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, and yet the sanctions that you have proposed with your French colleague yesterday are going to focus on individuals in Russia, no mention of the pipeline. Can you tell us why it was that you did not feel like you wanted to follow through with that suggestion?
Weil wir uns dagegen wehren, dass dieser
are against having this development against around Mr. Navalny being bilateralized as a German-Russian project. Those who were against Nord Stream 2 so far have used this situation once again to highlight this situation and put this project into the spotlight. It's an economic project. And they, of course, use the situation to try to destroy it. But for us, it is important to make sure that these are not German-Russian consequences that we draw, but that these are European ones. When a nerve agent from the Novichok group has been used, it's a breach of the international agreement under the OPCW, and the response can only be an international one. And that is what we do with our partners, what we've discussed with our partners and with France too, and what we launch, what we are launching. The discussion about Nord Stream 2 is a discussion that reflects many different interests. It is often said that we were being under Russian influence when it comes to gas exports, but I can only say we had imports of gas from Russia when the Soviet Union was still existed. We had the Cold War, and the US were those who criticized us most over the last year. They have doubled their heavy oil imports from Russia, so they are the second largest importer for Russia here. So I think it is important that such decisions are national decisions when it comes to energy supply, or European decision when it's about European supply, and these are not projects between Germany and Russia alone. It requires an international reaction, and this is why we need the consent of our international partners, and that's what we are working on in the European Union right now.
I think a follow-up question to that, gentlemen, would be, this has happened before, where promises have been made that we will take action, and comes back to my bark and bite question, and inevitably these are sanctions put on individuals rather than on a larger entity that might be responsible. We might have seen situations of that arise when it came to misinformation, disinformation, Ukraine, even at some point Belarus. I think the question is a valid one, where how much togetherness do you need to ensure that you actually find a reaction rather than a tokenism that might have been suggested? Ms. Dandias, do you want to give your perspective on this? And Ms. Lodria?
Be considered a little biased on my answer because of the recent experience we had on Cyprus and the sanctions that the Cypriot Republic asked to be brought upon Turkey from what was clearly an illegal intrusion in the Cypriot territorial waters and a couple of other huge provocations against a member state of the European Union. And yet again, the Union was extremely reluctant to impose sanctions on something that was a clear-cut case, really. It was black and white, which is very rarely the case. So the problem is that, as it was said before by my colleagues, that we have not arrived yet to a point of having a common foreign policy, a common security policy, and also the basic understanding that we must defend our values, not only the soft way, but also the hard way if needed. The European Union, although it's economically is a giant, military-wise, does not at all, or almost at all, act as a European Union. Let's take Libya as an example. It have taken months of negotiation to achieve what? Create a small fleet of 3 or 4 frigates which would just patrol 100 miles north of the Libyan coast in order to impose or help impose the arms embargo, which was decided by the United Nations. And we are living with a situation in Libya for years, which is a nightmare, and a nightmare for the European Union. We had allowed Russia to intervene in Libya, we had allowed Turkey to intervene in Libya, we have allowed Turkey to transfer thousands of jihadis from Syria to Libya, which pose a grave danger for the European Union in the future, jump to Lampedusa, to Sicily, to Italy, and so on. We have not reacted properly. But I have to say, if I would like to look to the optimistic side of things, as it was said before also by Bogdan, the European Union is a project into making. And it may take some time, but I'm optimistic that we will arrive there. It will take time, and we have to be trying and trying and trying more and more and more.
Let's get another question, if there's one in the room. Else I have a whole bunch of questions online. And I think this one would be quite a valid one for Minister Aurescu. Minister Aurescu, how do you imagine the relationship with Hungary and Poland will proceed after their slide to a, quote, illiberal democracy? And this comes from Nassim online.
Well, just to make the connection with the previous discussion, basically, I think the power of the European Union lays in its attractiveness. And its attractiveness is based on what EU represents in terms of values. What we have is not just an important economic power. We don't only have a huge population compared to other actors around the globe. We also have creativity and vitality of the people in the European Union. We have a lot of political and even an emerging military power resources. And we are building on all of this. But we also have this characteristic which is inherent to the European Union, the fact that it is multilateral in nature and it has an important set of democratic values at its core. And this is very attractive to what we have around us. And this attractiveness should play for the member states, even if, some of the member states choose perhaps another way to express their domestic political choices, if you mention the so-called illiberal democracy. But it is also very important to our neighborhoods. So if we want to have a global role, if we want to have real influence in the world, we have to start in our neighborhood. And with this, I agree with Yvonne, who mentioned this in the beginning. Again, we are in the making of a more coherent foreign policy, and this is an important goal to achieve. But at the same time, we shouldn't try to make the European Union as a state-like actor, because we are not a state-like actor, and we will not be a state-like actor. we are to well, put together and try to make a compromise in a positive sense in this sense between the reconciliation of the national interests of the member states and the common interest of the EU as a whole. So we have to find the common denominator, which is in fact the common interest of the EU as a whole. Sanctions. Sanctions are important as a tool, but not as such. Sanctions are important in order to make the well, target of those sanctions come back to the respect of the values and norms, which are at the core of the European Union and what we preach for others as well, without imposing them, but as a sort of a power of example. So if we choose not to use sanctions at some point in time, but the same goal is achieved through dialogue and negotiations and with a lot of diplomatic démarches, then that means that we have achieved our objective. So I think this is where we are in terms of well, values and principles. I think they are the most important resource that the EU has.
And I think Minister Lodrin wants to make a point on what you just said, so please hop in.
Oui, sur les sanctions, parce que le sujet a été abordé à plusieurs reprises. Je pense que c'est un outil important.
I believe the sanctions are an important tool.
Symbolique.
It is not something symbolic when we adopt sanctions, because they do have an impact, a negative impact on those targeted. If not, they would not keep asking for the lifting of the sanctions or to fight against the adoption of sanctions. So the sanctions are useful, efficient, and do bring about some clear consequences for the individuals and the entities, because the sanctions also apply to entities. So I would like to remind this, because sometimes people say, well, Europe will only adopt sanctions to showcase, to brag about it. It's not just a political stance. It is a tool at the service of the European Union, assuming, of course, they are clearly implemented and genuinely implemented, but that's the case. Second, we heard the word compromise on a number of occasions, with a tendency or a slight tendency to criticize this concept of compromise, something negative. But everything we've been doing together in Europe for years now, for 70 years, as a matter of fact, has always been based on compromises. But there's some very positive, very valuable compromises, very good for the future. So this is on this basis that we're acting. And sometimes compromises can be very positive and very offensive as well, even though there are different opinions expressed when we discuss. So we live on that, but it is also a strength. And thirdly, like I said in my speech, we're beginning to walk away from naivety, because we are beginning to look around, look at the world, becoming, like Yvonne very well said, becoming a global stakeholder. Because until recently, we did not fully stand for what we are. We sometimes felt that we were not such a power, whereas now we should have very much stand for it. Of course, it brings consequences, but we began already.
The question here, Minister Lodrin, then is, would you be tougher on a Belarus? Would you see the EU being tougher than it is on a Belarus?
L'Europe vient de prendre des mesures et des sanctions
recently adopted sanctions and measures to target those responsible for corruption and the electoral fraud in Belarus, and these are very significant decisions. You have a list of 40 individuals or entities, and these sanctions were adopted a week ago. So we shall see as to their impact, but it's not something small.
I think Minister Korchok, you wanted to hop in.
Yes. You asked a very good question, how much togetherness we would need in order to make bigger impact in the world. 100%, of course, but this would be absolutely naive to expect that in politics you can have 100% of something. Therefore, I believe that we will see a combination on the one hand, which I would prefer always that in foreign policy issues where basically interests of European Union as a whole are at stake, I would see a bigger role for the head of our foreign policy, and I will always support him in his effort to represent more boldly and assertively Europe on a global scene, our colleague Josep Borrell. But it will not be always possible, and I will support on behalf of Slovakia efforts where individual states are trying to help resolve some issues, and I will mention them, if it again serves European interest. Therefore, I entirely agreed and supported efforts by Heiko and Germany trying to de-escalate the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, this is absolutely good. If this helps, why shouldn't it be that we support one country? Jean-Yves has presented today, I think, fascinating speech about broad foreign policy issues. Rarely I'm making notes. This time I was making my notes when you spoke.
And at the
very end, this will be my last remark, you said what I believe in as a representative of a small country. The only way for us to sustain on a global scene is through multilateralism. And you've mentioned and referred to the alliance of multilateralism. I'm absolutely in favor of that. But we see these days that multilateralism as such is not enough. It must be, what we say, effective, because otherwise we see multilateralism failing in a way. What else, and this is really not diplomatic, but I'd like to describe things as they are, not as we would like to see them. Mm-hmm. Isn't it a bit an evidence of failure of multilateralism what we see in Nagorno-Karabakh right now? Because in the Minsk group since 1996, or I don't remember, 1994, it is a multilateral effort, but it is a frozen conflict. And frozen conflicts means that they always flare up when it serves one's interests. So absolutely in favor of maybe not effective but aggressive multilateralism, but all involved really engage with its full weight and impact in order to prevent us from really freezing conflicts. Yep. As we see it in, as I'm saying, in Nagorno-Karabakh. I hope Ukraine will never turn into frozen conflict. That would be very, very bad if something like this happens in direct neighborhood. So 100% togetherness when it serves European interest. On an ad hoc basis, I'm absolutely supportive of individual efforts. And number three, not effective but aggressive multilateralism. That would be something on behalf of my country.
You have led me very, very smoothly into my closing of this session. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I do want to go back to the panel and get your last words and last comments for this session on the fact that we are looking at a US election, a potential re-election of a president or a new presidency altogether. We are looking at issues with our neighbors across the board. When you take on that and what Mr. Korchok just said about multilateralism, are we looking at a redefinition of the phrase free world, multilateralism? What will change? What needs to change? And I'm going to magically set you about 45 seconds each to close this. Who would like to start? Should we go to Minister Aurescu? Might as well put him on the spot.
Well, thank you so much for this last question. In fact, it's putting the emphasis on, again, on what is very important for us as well, for the remaining foreign policy, but I also guess for EU foreign policy, which is the transatlantic link. Because we can't have just multilateralism and efficient or aggressive multilateralism. This multilateralism should be based on friends, and we need such friends. And irrespective who wins the elections in the United States, we need the transatlantic bond to be more coherent and firm. And this is because EU and the North America represent a one and single community of values and security. The fact that what is differentiating us for a time being, well, it's less important than what unites us. So this is extremely important for the EU foreign policy in order to be efficient. We need to, well, go over these differences and build a new transatlantic link, which is much better and coherent.
On that note, I'm going to give last comments to Minister Dendias.
Well, thank you. It's obvious it's not for us to say who would like to be the next president of the United States. It's for the American people. But there's one thing clear to me, that we need to engage with a new administration in a very positive way. The United States is a valued ally of Europe and also of the values that Europe represents. Sometimes there are misunderstandings, sometimes there are different interests, but yet again, engaging with the United States in the most positive way, I think it's the only option for Europe, and I leave it there.
Minister Lotterer?
Oh, j'ai dit tout à l'heure ce que je pensais du lien transatlantique.
Earlier what I thought about the transatlantic link, the necessity of strengthening it, but on a new basis, because we can see what the American trends are, and these are meant to last. It is not based on who is the president, one or another. No matter who is in charge, the stakes for the United States are different from what they were some 15 or 20 years ago. So the transatlantic link should be understood against this new background. So indeed, it should be strengthened, but cover not just security, also trade. And we need to discuss in all transparency with the Americans. And that goes is not in contradiction with multilateralism. What is multilateralism? It is the fact that members of the international community agree together on standards or rules on the main challenges we're facing and agree to comply with those rules. So it is about defining the rules and complying with the rules. And at the moment, we're seeing that this system is falling apart as it were built after the Second World War. So we need to redesign it, and this is what we're working on, including at the European level.
Minister Maas, since you were our wonderful, nice surprise for this afternoon, you get the final word.
Zunächst einmal hoffe ich, dass es nach der
First of all, I hope that after the elections in the US, there won't be any surprises, and that after the elections we will know who will be the next president and that everybody accepts the result. I don't have any illusions about the fact that the path of the United States will be to withdraw more from its international role, and I think that this will continue regardless of the result of the elections. That means Europe will have to assume more responsibility in terms of foreign policy and security policy. But I hope that the transatlantic relations will become better, and that there are good preconditions for that. There are multifold opportunities to do it in a better way than it has been done recently.
Ministers, all of you, thank you so very much for your kind words and also for your frank words at times. Please give up a round of applause for making the time to be here at GLOBSEC.